Our next speaker is A.J. Figueredo from very own University of Arizona to talk about the behavioral ecology of risk.
Okay. Now, many of the topics I'm going to be bringing up today are probably very well known to most of the people in this room, but what I'm hoping to do is put it together into a coherent picture that may not be as clear to everybody as I think it might be to me, and might be able to tie in a lot of these things together in terms of just integrating a lot of these things. Let's see, my laser work. Okay, good. And all right. Okay. The basic point I want to get across about risk is that social scientists use risk in a very different way than other people. And I kind of like the other definitions. This is not very good. Okay. Well, risk equals variance. Behavioral ecology and economics define risk mathematically as increased variance in outcomes. Now, outcomes may be distributed symmetrically about a mean payoff. Just consider a normal distribution, and there's a mean payoff, and there's an equal number of positive and negative outcomes. So under those circumstances, it may actually be adaptive to take risks because you have a 50-50 chance of a benefit as well as a loss, okay? Now with a mean expected outcome or payoff of 0, suppose that distribution is centered around 0, there is no a priori theoretical reason to avoid taking risks, is there? As Bruce pointed out, we make a lot of value judgments and risk is bad, and well, maybe not, okay? With a mean payoff of 0, which is not always the case, but it can be, there is no consistently expected loss associated with risk outcomes. Okay? Now, there is a possibility of negative outcomes. Not all risks are symmetrically distributed about the mean. For example, if I start running across the freeway without looking, that has a mean negative payoff. Okay? So not all of them have an equal likelihood of better and worse outcomes. So we can't assume this is always the case, but we have to acknowledge that it might be the case. Many risks are skewed systematically towards negative outcomes with few positive possibilities to recommend them. Of course, you should consider that there's also the possibility that some risks can have a mean positive payoff, can't they? Okay. Now the mental health model normally labels these risky behaviors as more properly, they should be taking risk-taking behaviors, deeming these behaviors ill-advised. Risk-taking behaviors defined this way have the statistical expectation of producing on the average a net loss rather than a net gain. That is, if they are associated systematically with negative outcomes. Okay? The trouble is that the mental health model generally does not distinguish between risk-taking behaviors that increase the outcome variance and those that reduce the outcome mean in the negative direction. Okay? This places undue emphasis upon costs and ignores the expected benefits of risk-taking, whether those benefits are real or perceived. Now, the implication in the previous talks, especially Bruce's, is that risk-taking may be warranted under certain circumstances, and if that is the case, we have to imagine that there are potential benefits here, otherwise it would never be worth it, okay? And the reason the mental health model does this is by conflating variable payoffs with expected losses, okay? The mental health model thereby treats risk-taking as pathological and in need of preventive interventions, okay? Now, there's been a lot of work done by this, for example, by a bunch of Nobel laureates, called prospect theory. It is a descriptive theory based upon choices that most people actually make under conditions of uncertainty. Now, this is a proximate level theory of the behavioral mechanisms that people actually exhibit. There's no prescriptions there for what you should or should not do. It is not an ultimate level theory of real-world functionality or the rationality of these responses. Most individuals from normative samples exhibit a pattern called loss aversion. Okay? That is a psychological overvaluing of the cost of losses as compared to the benefit of gains, which may perhaps explain our negative attitude towards risk. Okay? Loss aversion. The mental health model reflects this general attitude regarding the relative merits of risk-taking. Non-normative samples of socially deviant individuals may or may not deviate from its general pattern. A lot of these kids and stuff that we're talking about that we refer to as socially deviant, again, that's a value-laden construct, may not conform to this general pattern. The obvious prediction from an evolutionary thinking is that it is contingently adaptive, as Bruce pointed out, to take these risks for some individuals under specific circumstances, not at all times, and contrary to the seemingly normative consensus that this is a bad idea. Okay? Now, another very important dimension to be considered is the relative timing of expected costs and benefits. The fact that the costs and benefits of a certain risk-taking behavior may be displaced in time is another factor that influences a scientific perspective on risk-taking. Specifically, some behaviors produce short-term gains but long-term losses. Okay? Those behaviors are particularly difficult to deal with. Okay? On the other hand, other behaviors produce short-term losses but long-term gains. For example, everybody here who's been to graduate school is familiar with this, situation. Okay? But see, we think that's good, don't we? Okay? We have long-term thinking biases, probably most people in this room. The mental health model generally tends to regard long-term thinking and planning as desirable, short-term thinking and planning as undesirable. In contrast, behavioral ecologists and economists tend to regard discounting future losses in favor of more immediate gains as potentially adaptive, again, under certain circumstances. Discounting the benefits of immediate gains in contrast to a dread of future losses is a normative position taken by the mental health model, similar to an invariable preference for risk-averse behavior. Now again, there are actually more than two, but there are at least two dimensions going on here. One is being risk-averse. Another is the overvaluing of the future as opposed to the present. Okay? That's a different dimension, actually. Okay? Now, there may be temporal mismatches. There may be a mismatch in the timing of the expected gains and losses. This happens a lot. Why should they both come at the same time? There's no a priori reason to assume that. The four possible synchronies and asynchronies between costs and benefits can be cross-tabulated to show how the relative timing of costs and benefits can be, whether they be synchronous or asynchronous. Instead of reading those sentences, let me show you the picture. This covers a lot of words. There are two conditions of asynchrony, if I can get this laser to work. That's when either short-term benefits are exchanged for long-term losses or vice versa. When they are synchronous, there is rarely a problem. People were talking about behaviorism, and when they're on the same schedule, that tends not to be a problem in learning theory, but asynchronies do indeed create a problem for operant conditioning. Okay. Now, it depends, right? One cannot always assume the risk-taking behaviors to be maladaptive, even in the case of asynchronous timeframes of costs and benefits. Now, I'm not here to recommend risky behavior to people. I'm just saying you can't assume one way or the other that it's always going to be good or bad. Discounting future losses in favor of more immediate gains is the more adaptive strategy under some circumstances. Discounting immediate gains in favor of future losses is a more adaptive strategy under other circumstances. Now, obviously, because we're in this room doing this kind of thing, we were obviously in certain circumstances and not others that made us think this way, but we have to try to understand the people that we're not, okay? Presuming that one or the other set of relative valuations is inherently or universally superior to the other is unwise. Why? Because it's incorrect, okay? To paraphrase Darwin now, this view of risk is neutral towards risk-taking behavior. It is neither advocating nor condemning it, okay? The neutral stance permits us to view the etiology and maintenance of risk-taking behavior dispassionately. Examination of both the negative consequences and the positive incentives that might underlie risk-taking behavior. That's what it permits. Such a view permits a comprehensive look at the entire natural history of risk-taking behavior within a socio-ecological context. Okay? What is the natural history of risk-taking? First of all, a risk-taking propensity does not appear to be domain specific. I know a lot of us evolutionary psychologists are enamored with domain specificity, but once in a while we have to admit when things do not appear to be domain specific. Instead, risk-taking propensity appears to generalize across many different areas of life. Moreover, risk-taking behavior rarely occur in isolation but tends to cluster. They occur non-randomly among socio-ecological contexts, and they correlate strongly with situations that a Western culture characterizes as stressful, and Bruce said enough about that for now, so I won't belabor that point. So, what lies beneath? Our data from our lab, for example, indicate that the social and ecological context, the clusters of behavior and outcomes associated with them, serve as proxies for a single latent multivariate construct, and that changing a specific or even a set of behavioral strategies within the cluster without changing the context in which they occur will be ineffective. When it comes to discussion, if you want me to elaborate on that, I can give more specific examples. Now, the mental health model has not provided adequate causal explanations for the existence of these clusters. They go, these adverse conditions produce all these bad outcomes, again with all these value judgment words, but it has not provided either pure or applied guidance for those who wish to address the problems systematically. Why does it produce those outcomes and not others? For that guidance, we turn to evolutionary biology. Okay? Life history theory, as already introduced by Bruce with the slow and fast thing, is a mid-level theory that describes the strategic allocation of bioenergetic and material resources between two major components of fitness. One is somatic effort, referring to the resources devoted to the survival of the individual organism along life, health, education, welfare, all that stuff. Reproductive effort, okay, refers to the resources devoted to the production of new organisms as vehicles devoted to the perpetuation of the individual's genes, and can be further partitioned into two subcomponents: mating effort and parental or nepotistic effort. Mating effort refers to the resources devoted to acquiring and retaining sexual partners. Parental and nepotistic effort refers to resources devoting to enhancing the survival of existing offspring and other genetic relatives. Now, we talk about parenting, parental neglect, all this kind of stuff at issue with adolescent development. We're talking about parental effort. We're talking about the behavior of the actual adolescents. Well, there's a lot of mating effort there. And as any of you who are parents know, once you're putting in a lot of parental effort, the mating effort kind of goes downhill, doesn't it? I mean, you don't have a lot of resources left for that, okay? Thus, a life history strategy allocates an individual's bioenergetic and material resources among the competing demands of survival and reproduction. Which of these things do we have to do? Well, pretty much all of them. But how much of my resources should I allocate to each one? Well, it depends, okay? Oops. Predictions. Life history theory provides a unique perspective on both the environmental and behavioral context in which a high-risk behavior may occur. This is our payoff for going into this weird area. The fast-slow, previously known as the RK continuum, represents a covariant range of reproductive behavioral strategies inversely relating life history traits such as fecundity and parenting. Life history theory predicts that all else being equal, as Bruce pointed out, species and individuals living in harsh, high risk of mortality, unpredictable and uncontrollable environments evolve clusters of fast life history traits associated with fast reproductive rates, nominal parental investment, and relatively brief intergenerational times, such as teenage pregnancy. Species living in predictable, stable, and relatively safe and controllable environmental conditions evolve clusters of slow life history traits associated with slow reproductive rates, extensive parental investment, extended intergeneration times, grad school, conferences, this kind of thing, okay? Life history theory therefore predicts that the fast strategist is a short-term planner taking benefits opportunistically with little regard for long-term consequences. The slow strategist is a long-term planner delaying immediate gratification in the service of future eventualities, which again now gives us a window to look back at these risk attitudes, doesn't it? Okay. Now, the uncontrollable and unpredictable environments. This theoretical framework also provides a unique perspective on why clusters of risk-taking behavior tend to occur under stressful environmental circumstances. Remember, the mental health model just says it does because they're bad, but it doesn't tell you why these things might be adaptive. Unpredictable events are especially stressful by virtue of interfering with the organism's ability to solve adaptive problems, such as avoiding or escaping future aversive events. The relation between behavior and outcome defines an uncontrollable event. Whether an organism responds or not in any particular way is relevant to the likelihood of the outcome. Although an event can be predictable without being controllable, controllable events are predictable by definition. Controllability can thus be seen as a special case of predictability, and an unpredictable environment is therefore uncontrollable. If you know the classic work with Seligman and the learned helplessness in dogs and stuff, you know that predictability is not enough. Even when they get the same amount of shock, the dog that can control the taking of shocks or not does better than the dogs that cannot control it. The dog that cannot control it develops anxiety, depression, all these other traits that we associate with psychopathology due to that lack of control. It's not just getting shocks versus not getting shocks, and that's the difference that Bruce was implying between Jakarta and Chicago. Okay. What is the evolution of risk-taking then? It is an axiom of life history theory that unpredictable and uncontrollable environments favor the evolution of life history strategies. Bruce already gave you this reference of this thing that we worked on for 2 years, that document all those relationships. Therefore, under those circumstances, what traditional social sciences consider risk or risk-taking behaviors might actually be adaptive, accepting a higher variance in outcomes and discounting potential future losses because you might be dead by then. Okay? A slow strategy is neither superior nor inferior to a fast one in purely Darwinian terms. Superiority depends on the ecology in which the organism is situated, and that's one thing that I guess those social Darwinists of the past did not take into consideration in running around trying to sterilize people and whatnot. Okay? The mental health model does not adequately distinguish between behavioral dispositions that tend to produce harm to the self and those that produce harm to others. In philosophical circles, these two things are quite distinct, but for example, in criteria that psychologists use for commitment to a mental institution, they are conflated. This is perhaps because these behaviors generally tend to be highly correlated with each other. Now, evolutionists might ask, why is that so? What does harm to self and harm to others have to do with each other? And those reasons have not been made completely clear. Risk-taking behaviors are generally deemed to produce harm to the self, although that may or may not be true. But our theoretical analysis indicates that that may not universally be the case. Now, antisocial behaviors are generally deemed to produce harm to others. That's why we call them antisocial. But whether they do or do not produce harm to the self is also open to question. What if I'm antisocial and I'm benefiting myself? That can happen. Okay. Now, little detour into Neil Malamuth's confluence model. This had to do originally with sexual offending, sexual coercion. Malamuth's confluence model describes a generalized disposition towards rape as being influenced by multiple specific pathways. But these pathways, which roughly are promiscuity and hostility, are ultimately driven by an even more generalized disposition towards relationships with members of the opposite sex. Malamuth suggested two general sexual strategies at opposite ends of a continuum: convergent interest sexual strategy and divergent interest sexual strategy. Specifically, males following the convergent interest strategy see their reproductive interests and those of the female, now these are usually sex-offending males he was talking about, as mutually consistent or mutualistic. They base their relationships with females on this perceived common ground of shared interests. Those are generally the people that do not engage in sexual coercion. In contrast, males following the divergent interest strategy see their reproductive interests in those females as mutually inconsistent or antagonistic. They base their intersexual relationships on this perceived conflict of interests. Okay? Now, what does confluence have to do with life history strategy? Well, Malamuth himself suggests that the selection of these strategies during development might be biased by different life history strategies. Slow strategies are more prone to adopt convergent interest or mutualistic sexual strategies. Fast strategists are more prone to adopt divergent or antagonistic sexual interest strategies. Convergent interest or mutualistic strategies are more consistent with long-term sexual relationships and cooperative biparental care. Divergent interests, on the other hand, or antagonistic strategies, are clearly inconsistent with these long-term reproductive tactics. If you're going to raise a young human for, 10, 20 years, possibly 30, right? Who knows? They're pushing 40 now. Okay. You kind of have to have a convergent interest strategy with your partner if you're going to provide biparental care. Otherwise, it can be really stressful in and of itself. Okay. So, what is the relationship between the sexual and the social? Well, in the proposed extension of this model beyond the sexual and into the general social domain, we, meaning me and Jake here, further suggest that slow life history strategists are more prone to adopt otherwise equivalent convergent interest social strategies. Fast life history strategies are more prone to otherwise adopt equivalent divergent interest social strategies. Now, Malamuth also cautiously suggests that a generalized competitive or cooperative disposition may exist, but did not develop this idea much further. I wrote to him, sent him my ideas based on his to see what he thought about him, because I've been friends with him for years, and he said, oh yeah, that's fine, but you say it, not me. Okay. He's cautious. Okay, maybe risk averse, I don't know. Okay. So, but I want to give credit where credit is due. Supporting evidence. Slow life history strategists are more likely to engage in reciprocally altruistic relationships with both kin and non-kin, as well as with both romantic and not just sexual romantic partners and with their offspring. Slow life history strategists clearly prefer long-term and cooperative social as well as sexual relationships. Evidently easier and more profitable to maintain in their characteristically more stable, predictable, and controllable environments. This makes sense. Now, there's convergent evidence from game theoretic analyses that indicates that unstable or shorter term, especially one-shot social interactions like one-shot prisoner's dilemma and stuff like that, are likely to lead to more defection, aka cheating, than cooperation, likely to see your interest as in conflict with those of others. Whereas repeated, iterative prisoner's dilemma, long-term strategies seem to be favored. So this could have to do with the nature of the game. Okay? Attachment. Life history strategists are also associated with different attachment styles. Slow life history strategists have secure attachment styles. Okay? Fast life history strategies have any of several insecure attachment styles, such as anxious or avoidant. And we actually have evidence for this, but this is a theoretical talk. I can tell you about evidence later, or Marco can do that for you. Okay? Recall that Bowlby related these attachment styles with internal working models of self-other relationships, which is precisely what we're talking about, is these antagonistic and mutualistic things. Now, this has been extended and generalized to sexual and social relationships and not just parent-child bonds. Remember, I'm talking about domain general adaptations here. Okay? There's a whole bunch of people that have coined different expressions for the same idea. Don't want to represent these as our original ideas. They're not. In fact, some of the people are here right now. Okay? Different words that were used. These guys, just this year, describe these in different internal working models as early maladaptive schemas. Okay, although the plural is really schemata. Okay, I'm just being persnickety. Belsky, Draper, and Steinberg associated this with an mistrustful internal working model and opportunistic interpersonal orientation, associating secure attachment with a trusting internal working model and reciprocally rewarding interpersonal orientation. You can line up all these words. To me, they mean the same thing. Ross and Hill have also associated this with, quote, a pervasive belief that people are unpredictable and the world is chaotic. Sounds just like what Bruce was talking about. They further associate the unpredictability schema to an external locus of control. Helplessness, causal uncertainty, like those depressed dogs, decreased interpersonal trust, decreased sense of coherence, decreased future orientation, as in the risk models, and decreased delay of gratification, as well as increased impulsivity, sensation-seeking, risk-taking behaviors, early sexual activity, risky sexual behavior, adolescent pregnancy, and childbearing. Now you see these clusters that the mental health model puts together for no apparent reason, just because they're bad, are now beginning to make sense. They're part of a coherent, contingent adaptation, aren't they? They make sense together. They're not just bad things, okay? Life history theory does not regard these social schemata as particularly maladaptive, as that recent paper refers to them, but instead as contingently adaptive in different environments. Specifically, such schemata might be adaptive in the various environments where life history strategies evolve and develop. Furthermore, these schemata might be ultimately boiled down to Malamud's convergent and divergent interest strategies as far as what that model is about, generalized beyond the sexual and into the social arena. Okay. Now, of course, there's nature-nurture conflicts, as always, unless you have those rats, but a lot of us don't have the rats. It is unclear to what extent these early schematas are environmentally determined products of specific developmental conditions, or they're evolved inheritable strategies that are spuriously associated with those developmental conditions by gene-environment correlations, presumably generated by the strategic dispositions of the parents, which are generating that environment, and they're also transmitting genetically those traits to the offspring. So hence, the social schema hypothesis is beset by the same nature-nurture confounds that afflict the much-disputed father-absence effect, and Jay is going to present the very next talk that addresses some of those concerns. Okay. So, life history and social conflict. Now here I'm going to talk a little bit about our work, but just briefly. Either way, whether it's nature or nurture, and I haven't taken a position on that because it's usually 50-50, this general theory of convergent and divergent interests in social strategies provides a highly parsimonious explanation for the inverse relationships between slow life history strategy and socially conflictive attitudes and behaviors such as, and a lot of this, some of this has gotten published and some not yet, but if anybody wants to hear about it, we've associated slow life history strategies with a variety of these antagonistic outcomes. Okay. Okay. Now, what is the relationship then, coming back to my philosophical question, between harm to self and harm to others? Because evolutionists, being kind of cynical folk, would say, why can't I harm others without harming myself? Bob Trivers, for example, is one example of people who are fond of this kind of thing. I don't mean in person, I mean in his theories. Okay, these considerations help elucidate why behavioral dispositions that turn to produce harm to self and harm to others are normally conflated in the traditional social sciences. Why are these things conflated by people? Well, because they actually are. Bluntly put, behavioral preferences and dispositions that produce harm to self are quite consistent with dispositions and abilities that tend to produce harm to others. Okay? Objectively, divergent interest or antagonistic social strategies are inherently riskier than convergent interests or mutualistic social strategies. Why? Well, for example, there's an increased risk of intraspecific aggression, for example, retaliation that they occasion. If I run around being antagonistic with anybody, I'm going to make a lot of enemies, and they might choose to do harm to others themselves, meaning me, and this is a risk in and of itself. They're not going to take this sitting down. Okay? Socially conflictive behaviors in response to real or perceived conflict of interest with others reflect back upon the perpetrator in producing risk of harm to the self. For example, Dodge's famous hostile attribution. If you run around in your head thinking that everybody else is hostile, you will actually create that hostility because you're going to freak people out and they're going to wonder, why is this person waiting for me to attack him? Dodge didn't quite say it that way, but I'm just trying to be fast here. Okay? Regardless of life history strategy, a target of aggression more than likely strikes back in response to the aggression. This makes that conflictive style risky. Okay? Harshness and unpredictability. Bruce mentioned these things. These same conditions of environmental harshness and unpredictability that foster the evolution and development of fast life history strategies simultaneously foster these divergent interests or antagonistic social strategies according to all these theories I listed there, and general risk-taking propensities, so that harm to others and potential harm to self are therefore intimately intertwined in multiple ways and at multiple levels that are difficult to disentangle in the real world. So we really can't blame the mental health model too much for not thinking very clearly about these two different features, because what you observe out there is a high correlation between all of these behaviors involving both harm to self and harm to others. Okay? So before we get too superior about it, we should realize there are facts here on the ground that make people think a certain way. Okay? One of the things that biases many of us in this room, I can tell by looking around, is Western individualism. Okay? The prevailing cultural values of individualism in Western civilization, which have been massively documented, that's not my characterization, are at odds with evolutionary reasoning, as a couple of the previous speakers have already pointed out. Adaptive to us means fostering genetic replication. We have a very weird definition of what's adaptive. Okay? It is not necessarily the long-term survival of the individual. Organisms are expendable vehicles for genes, right? Your genes will throw you under the bus in a heartbeat if it's going to help them replicate. Okay? It's a cruel fact, but that is the truth. You may be sacrificed for the genetic fitness benefit that your death will occasion. Okay? Fast life history strategies, for example, produce cheap and numerous genetically expendable organisms. The lack of somatic effort expended is strategic. The life history strategy knows, in a sense, that a lot of these guys are going to die, but it does it anyway because of genetic benefits. Okay? In contrast, Western individualism, which most of the people, I think, share these values, at least in this room, sets the welfare of the individual organism as the highest value, and so does that mental health model. Because why? Because we made it, right? Now, not necessarily genetic replication. Okay? Nobody talks about that. So even harm to self is culturally abhorrent, not just harm to others. Obviously, all societies are going to abhor harm to others because I'm one of those others and I don't want that happening. But why are we so upset about harm to self? It's because we believe the welfare of the individual, and I'm no different in my values. I believe the same way. But as an evolutionist, I have to say, wait a second, that's not the way nature works. Behaviors associated with fast life history strategies are generally devalued in Western civilization and pathologized by the traditional social sciences. In specific, the mental health model views them as psychopathology because it harms those people as people who we think of as human beings, and it's a noble and admirable way to think, but it screws up your brain if you're an evolutionist because you have to think of them as expendable vehicles for genes if you're a true evolutionist and not be so concerned with their welfare. Okay? In understanding these strategies, we're pathologizing these behaviors which do harm to self and harm to others. They may not be pathological from an evolutionary perspective. So, in conclusion, the main contribution of this analysis, as I see it, has therefore not to identify either high time preferences or antagonistic and divergent intersocial schemata as predictors of risk-taking behavior. Everybody knows this, okay? These various contributing factors had already been separately identified by a number of people, some of them present, okay? Instead, what I believe the main contribution of this analysis has been is to bring them all together under the common rubric of reproductive life history strategy as the ultimate cause and adaptive explanation for their convergent and interdependent effect. This fundamental insight represents a necessary first step in constructing a behavioral ecology of risk. Okay? Well, so am I on time? Hey, okay. I have a genetic advantage in talking fast because I'm Cuban. Yes.
So shall we set up the next one while we have a few questions? Is that right?
Yeah.
Fine with me, unless anybody needs to see
I'd
another
like to
slide.
address the issue of pathologizing and superior and inferior.
Yes.
And I want to make a case for saying that it is possible. There is a legitimacy of making a normative judgment, despite what you say. So I agree with what you say, but, and to encapsulate it as an example, let's take the case of one-shot games versus repeated games. And we know that for good game theorists, one-shot games, non-cooperation is the superior strategy. Repeated games, cooperation is the superior strategy. So when you say it's all context dependent, right? Not inferior, it all depends.
Right.
Nevertheless, as social planners, we have clear justification for saying, let's construct a social environment where there's multiple interactions, not one-shot games. We'll all be better off if we do that, won't we? And so I think that there's a normative level, which is on top of the point that you made, not inferior, not superior, it's all context dependent as far as what's adaptive in the evolutionary sense is concerned. But if we're trying to plan for the welfare of all of us, which is what anyone is doing when they put on their social planner hat.
Well, that's what we do.
Well, I think it's what anyone does when they think in terms of what's best for all of us.
Yes, if they think that way. You see what I'm saying? I'll defer to the anthropologist here, but I'm saying that we have to recognize, and I completely agree with you, I have those same values. I'm one of these Western imperialist guys, quotes dead white males, and all this kind of stuff. I probably have extremely similar beliefs to you, okay? But my point is that this is because of who we are. This is because of our life history strategy, our evolved culture, and we think this way. I am going to agree with you. I don't think anybody's at this conference who's going to argue for chaos, disorder, and violence. Okay? But we have to understand that that's about us. That's not a law of nature.
No, I'm not. I mean, I disagree here. So here's a
Okay,
here's
well, there's a
nice,
disagreement. There
so
you
I
go.
think this
That's
is something
good.
that will be on the table.
Okay.
This is not a matter of cultural provincialism.
Uh-huh.
This is not a matter of culture A thinks this, culture B thinks that.
Uh-huh.
It's an objective sense in which we can say that a society that is cooperative is going to do better than one that's non-cooperative. And part of this has to do with
In
levels.
intergroup competition, yeah.
Part of this has to do with levels of selection,
Yes.
which we can get to. There's
I
another
agree with you, yes.
objective way in which we have to evaluate adaptation at more than one level, basically. So this is just a little entree into some factors.
No,
I
but
think
that
we'll be
is
considering
really
more
worthy
generally.
of discussion, because I again agree with you completely that the reason it might be advantageous is an intergroup competition. But there's costs of freedom and autonomy to the individual, which some people don't like to give up, right? And, you know, I'm willing to do that, you know, because I'm rah-rah group, right? But, you know, being a Western imperialist and all that. But, you know, I'm just trying to divorce our analysis, you know, from the value judgments which I know that I'm likely to make, okay, because of who I am. And I just realized I've done a lot of cross-cultural research. I've talked to a lot of people. Not everybody agrees that this is the best way to go.
Well, cultural variation, too. And
Yeah.
that's another point I'm going to make at some point, not now
Yeah.
because things have to be kept brief. But I think that there's
Yeah.
a sense in which everything we've heard up to now is very much along the lines of very gene-centric, right? Of course, we expect that from evolutionists, but we need to take cultural evolution seriously, too.
Yes.
You are in what you just said, but I think the paradigm here, the kind of the prevailing paradigm, is, and which is a part of the story, so I'm not criticizing it, other than to say that it's not the whole story, is this is very much a case of innate psychological response, innate phenotypic plasticity, basically.
Yes.
And there's a cultural layer that needs to come in, as you yourself are emphasizing.
Absolutely.
But this is what's going to unfold, I think, as part of.
And I think that in order to some extent, step outside our own skins and see our value judgments for what they are, we need to realize how much we're conditioned by our own life history strategy and how this is really biasing the way we view things, right? Now, when push comes to shove, you press me on it, I'm going to say, yeah, I agree that these things are good, because that's the way I feel. But as scientists, I think we have to divorce ourselves a little bit from that and say, well, that's just me. You see what I'm saying? That's all I'm saying. Again, that's worthy subject for debate, but I'm just declaring the position that we really have to realize that. Okay, let me give an example. These projects, okay, like the Oregon stuff, I don't really know the facts on this, maybe some of these does, but I know there's other social interventions where they've plucked kids out of these nasty environments, taught them cooperative, lawful, respectful behavior, and as long as they were in that environment, they did well. As soon as you release them back into their natural environment, sorry, I'm an old animal behaviorist, so I tend to talk that way, things go to hell in a handbag and they don't do well, and there's plenty of studies that have shown that. So we have to realize that in the context in which we live, in which we'd like people to live because of who we are, right, the behaviors we do are good. When you teach them these behaviors and you put them back in that nasty place, they are at a disadvantage all
I
of a
couldn't
sudden.
agree more. So,
Yeah,
I think we're actually agreeing, but
Yeah.
it requires quite a bit of stage setting in order to
Yeah,
get
I
all
know,
these different
I know.
things right.
And does anybody know what happens to these Oregon kids when they're let go? That's a real question, that's not rhetorical. Because I've heard news from other programs that it's not good,
Yeah.
in spite of the short-term gain, as long as you have them under the supervision of all these psychologists and stuff in a nice, peaceful, lawful situation. But my impression is they get the crap beat out of them in their old neighborhood.
Yeah, don't turn someone into an altruist and then put them into a one-shot game situation. Is the-
Exactly right. So we have to consider that in terms of social policy.
One of the points of those programs, and I'm trying to remember the details, but one of the big points of these programs, the Oregon one as well, is they don't go back to the same environment. In other words, you equip them
Mhm.
to also have some skills that get them into different spaces. This is not just jobs, it has to do with education and
Yeah.
package of stuff, and I think, this is Capaldi and all those folks, I think that's part of that.
Well, that would be the
package
thing to do,
right?
but it has not always been done.
Yeah.
In fact, it has
Yeah.
generally not been
But I
done.
think this is
Yeah.
a really important point, that,
Yes.
to reify to the person the environment from which they're coming, that part of the change can be, that they have a different range of environments in which they might be
Yes.
able to operate, right?
And one of the basic weaknesses of the mental health model is it identifies this as a pathology within the individual. And if I can take that individual out and I can fix them up, problem solved, because they were crazy, right? So now I fix them up, they're normal, then I let them go and everything will be hunky-dory. But if it's not an individual pathology but a systemic problem, then we have a serious problem with the mental health conception of this.
That's,
Can I sit down yet, or?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, can
I
I
can
sit
see we're bursting to ask questions. And
Okay.
We're trying to